Good day. In our main channel, The Duran, my colleague Alex Christoforou and I recently did a programme about the recent election result in Saxony-Anhalt, which resulted in a runaway victory for Angela Merkel's CDU party, consolidating the CDU's position as the leading party in Germany and making it now highly likely that it will form the next government in Germany after the September 2021 elections, leading to Merkel's anointed successor, Armin Laschet, replacing her as Germany's Chancellor. If you want a detailed analysis and discussion of that result, I would refer you to that video which Alex and I did on the Duran. Briefly and very simply, it was always plain to me that the CDU, which has been the ruling party in Saxony-Anhalt for a long time, stood a very strong prospect of retaining its position as the leading party in that particular land. And I was always mistrustful of opinion polls which were published shortly before the election, which suggested a very close race with the AfD, the right-wing party that is becoming increasingly strong in eastern Germany, which showed that the AfD was actually ahead of the CDU in that race. As I discussed in that video, it is an extremely common practice in elections. It takes place all around the world for parties that are concerned about the strength of their support and anxious to win a big result to play up the strength of their opponent on the eve of an election in order to make it appear that the race is closer than it really is. That way, they harden up their support during the election itself, persuading more of their supporters to come out and vote for them, whilst at the same time making their victory even more resounding than it might otherwise have been, and suggesting that their opponent is actually weaker than in some ways that opponent really is. I've seen that happen in many elections. I saw it happen, for example, in the recent presidential elections in the United States, and I also saw the same thing take place many years ago, especially in France, where that kind of thing is extremely common. For the record, I consider this sort of practice, which can involve manipulation of opinion poll results, rather sharp, but to my mind, it falls within just the range of legitimate electoral and political activity. Elections and politics are, as one might say, a rough trade, and one should not be too surprised that these sort of things happen. Certainly, politics at this level are not for the squeamish. As to the actual results themselves, I have no doubt that they are accurate. I know there have been some rumblings from AfD supporters who claim otherwise, but I noticed that the AfD leadership has accepted the results in Saxony-Anhalt, and I think we should do so also. Of far greater significance than the election in Saxony-Anhalt has been the biggest story in Germany over the last few weeks and months, which has been the collapse of the Greens, who at one point looked like they might be an unstoppable force in Germany. Until a short while ago, a relatively short while ago, there were even suggestions that the Greens might soon become the dominant party in Germany and might even become the largest party in Germany following the September elections, with Green candidates being brought forward, the Green leadership actually getting first choice to form the government, and with the Green being appointed Chancellor. Well, that is clearly not happening. On the contrary, the Green advance has now gone into reverse, and the Greens seem to be losing support. And perhaps the best explanation of that in the mainstream media has appeared in an article for the Daily Telegraph by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who is a commentator I've often quoted because of his very prescient and insightful pieces that he writes about European affairs. I would add in quickly and in parenthesis that though I consider Ambrose Evans Pritchard an insightful writer on European affairs, I do not consider him so when discussing his other hobby horses like the Chinese economy, about which he has written what I think is a barely deranged piece, and about politics in the United States. But on Europe, as I said, I find him insightful, and especially specifically on Germany, which he appears to know well, he writes with acuity and interest. And this is what he has to say about the Greens. When Green candidate Annalena Baerbock was asked the same question on foreign policy, her Pavlovian non sequitur response was to agitate for more Europe, which captures a fundamental issue of ideology. Baerbock is a reflexive supranationalist. There is little for the place for the democratic nation state in her philosophy. Labels can be confusing. The German Greens are not particularly green any longer by OECD standards. Their 2030 coal ban and CO2 emission targets are both less ambitious than laws already passed by a British Tory government. They have instead evolved into a hardline Europeanist movement, advocates of EU fiscal union, a joint foreign policy, and a European defence force. They want to whittle down the national veto. In short, they have become, within Germany, the Brussels party, even though they have not gone as far as many British Greens in actively trying to break their own country up. And I think this is exactly right. This is exactly what the position of the Greens in Germany is. Once upon a time, not so long ago, the Greens were primarily an ecological, anti-war, anti-nuclear party. That was very much the case in the early 1980s when they were led by such people as the radical socialist and feminist Petra Kelly. Today, the Greens are completely different. They have become the Europeanist, Atlanticist, integrationist party in Germany par excellence. Not only is their policy essentially more Europe, a line, by the way, which has been popularized principally by Emmanuel Macron of France, but they are also ardent Atlanticists and ardent opponents and critics within Germany of good relations with Russia. For example, they were staunch opponents of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They are big supporters of the Magnitsky Acts and their various European manifestations, which seek or purport to impose sanctions on Russia for various human rights transgressions, real or imagined. And they are also, and this has been particularly shocking to some Green supporters, fervid advocates and supporters of Ukraine. This went so far that recently an important member of the Green leadership team actually went to Ukraine, visited the front line, put on a flak jacket and helmet, spoke about his support for Ukraine, and called for Ukraine to be supplied with weapons. a policy which Germany, as a state, actually opposes. There was, by the way, a major backlash against that action, and unsurprisingly, the Greens had to backtrack to saying that the weapons that were being talked about were not real kinetic weapons, but things like night goggles and that kind of thing. I don't think anybody truly who follows the Greens carefully actually believes that. So there we are, a Europeanist, Atlanticist, neocon or neoliberal party with all the usual policies and ideas that one might associate with a party like that. It continues to retain a certain hold over a part of the German electorate because of legacy issues left over from the old days when it was led by people like Petra Kelly. So most Germans still think of the Greens as an ecological party, and much of the Greens' electoral base and much of the Greens' mass membership still takes its old anti-war and ecological position seriously. The leadership, however, increasingly doesn't. Their priorities lie elsewhere. Now, the problem the Greens have is that not only do these ardently Atlanticist and Europeanist positions, which they have adopted, cut across the feelings and views of many of their supporters, but they are also becoming increasingly unpopular and mistrusted in Germany as a whole. Germans over the last few years have become more suspicious, not less, of more Europe. They become wary of providing financial help to the southern states of Europe. They are unhappy about the negative interest rate policies pursued by the European Central Bank, and they are also increasingly skeptical, indeed, frankly hostile to the whole concept of Eurobonds. On top of all of that, there's been an increasing trend within Germany to be, if not exactly mistrustful of the United States, at least seeking a greater distance from the United States. And of course, on this issue that the Greens have made such an important part of their current programme, relations with Russia, they are isolated not just from all other German parties, but from the overwhelming weight of German opinion, and especially of German business opinion. Whereas the Greens oppose Nord Stream 2, most German business people strongly support it. Whereas the Greens want a more confrontational policy towards Russia, the German business community and indeed many Germans want the reverse. So it is not surprising that under the pressure of an election campaign, these contradictions in the Green position, contradictions between the policies that the Green leadership espouses and what most Germans think and feel about issues, including many Germans who are naturally predisposed to vote for the Greens and who form part of the Greens' electoral base, are becoming increasingly exposed, so that the Greens are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain themselves and are seeing their support decline. Now, for the moment, that decline is not a rout. They are still a strong, polling strongly, though less strongly than they were, and though they have been overtaken again by the CDU, CSU, they are still well ahead of the formerly dominant left-wing party in Germany, the SPD, which seems to be, in truth, in a death spiral. So I would expect the Greens still to increase on their vote over the one that they achieved in the last election, which took place back in 2017. Having said that, it's not certain that that will be so, and it is looking increasingly unlikely, indeed very unlikely, that it will be the Greens who will pick the Chancellor and who will form the next German government. Now, what does that mean for the future? It means, firstly, that Armin Laschet, whom I've discussed in previous programmes on this channel, is likely to become the next German Chancellor. And he is increasingly becoming not exactly Eurosceptic. At least he seems to be cooling on ideas like Eurobonds and all the rest, which he has shown a certain willingness to consider up to now. But perhaps more importantly, he has appeared in terms of foreign policy as a consistent spokesman of good relations, or at least better relations, with Russia. And I would expect that once he becomes Chancellor, which I think is now all but inevitable, he will actually and actively pursue that objective, and we will see something starting to happen, finally, in terms of relations between Russia and Germany and Russia and Europe, which we have not seen up to now. Merkel, by contrast, has always played on the question of relations with Russia a very complicated game, seeming at times to favour better relations, but simultaneously taking extremely harsh actions against the Russians, which have in truth poisoned the entire relationship between Russia and Germany and Russia and the EU. I sense that Laschet will want to reverse that. But perhaps that is not the priority for most Germans. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. A victory for the CDU in Germany and Armin Laschet, Chancellor of Germany, means for Germany more of the same. It will mean Merkelism continuing without Merkel, despite and notwithstanding the steady loss of economic dynamism and competitiveness that is now becoming increasingly obvious across German society and the German economy. That, for me, is a sad thing, given what I know of Germany and the enormous potentials the country has, and the fact that it should be a leader. But there we are. That is the prospect we are facing in Germany now. And perhaps it brings up the larger issue, which is that the effect of the European Union, an unacknowledged effect, but it seems to me a very true one, is that across Europe, across the European Union, it is destroying alternatives to the stagnant and increasingly immobile status quo. We've seen challenges from the right in Germany, like those from the AfD, fade away. We've seen challenges from the left, like one that was at one time posed by Die Linke, also fade away. In both cases, one suspects, because of the impossibility of affecting their programs within the EU framework, which massively constrains what governments can do. We've seen phony oppositions, like those of the Greens, rising at times to fill the space, and we get impression that many Germans are increasingly dissatisfied and unhappy with the status quo and would willingly seek alternatives if they were offered to them. But ultimately, because of Germany's position within the EU and the Eurozone, and its central position both in the EU and in the Eurozone, ultimately and always, things go back to how they were, reverting to a status quo which nobody is truly happy with and which is allowing problems to increase all around, and which throws up leaders like Armin Laschet, who, for all his acknowledged decency, is hardly the dynamic leader that Germany needs at a time like this. The more things change, the more they remain the same. As my colleague Alex Christoforou said on our video, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. That is exactly what Europe faces. Growing immobilism, growing stagnation, an inability of alternatives to express themselves and to gain traction as the status quo perpetuates itself indefinitely. Ultimately, this is an unsustainable situation, and sooner or later, perhaps later rather than sooner, we will see a systems breakdown. But until that happens, we must adjust and accept that the reality of European politics will be more of the same. Thank you very much for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on other channels that we do. The Duran, where I do programs with Alex Christoforou. Please also, by the way, check out Alex's channel, and please check us out on our various platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, Super U, and Locals. Don't forget also, to the extent that you can, to support us via Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. And last but not least, go to our Discourse server and also check out our shop and buy the wonderful things that you will find there, our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please remember to press the like button on this video if you've liked this program, and also please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you very much, and I thank you for joining me for today for this program, and I look forward to you joining me soon on future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.